Most people assume the opposite of loneliness is being surrounded by people. Carl Jung thought that was almost exactly backwards. He'd seen it too many times in his own consulting room. People who were never alone, who had families, colleagues, full calendars, and who described, almost apologetically, a hollow feeling they couldn't quite locate. And he'd seen the opposite too. People who spent long stretches of time by themselves, by choice, who weren't lonely at all. If anything, they seemed more whole the longer they'd had to themselves. Jung wrote in his memoir that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. Which means the entire question of whether solitude is good or bad for you was, to Jung, the wrong question. The real question was something else, and it has very little to do with how many people are in the room. There's a version of this most people have felt without ever naming it. A room full of friendly conversation, nothing wrong with any of it, and underneath it, a small persistent sense of standing slightly outside your own life, watching it happen rather than being inside it. That feeling isn't about the people in the room, it's about something quieter, something that has very little to do with company at all. In the system Jung is best known for originating, he described people as having a kind of default direction for their psychic energy, outward toward the external world of people, activity, and stimulation, which he called extroversion, or inward toward the internal world of thoughts, impressions, and reflection, which he called introversion. This wasn't a personality quiz category to Jung. It was closer to a description of where a person's energy naturally flows, and, just as importantly, where it replenishes. For someone oriented inward, time spent in the external world, even time spent doing things they enjoy, with people they love, draws down a kind of internal reserve. And solitude isn't the absence of something, it's where that reserve refills. This is why someone can come home from a wonderful evening with people they genuinely care about and feel not sad, not regretful, just empty, in a way that has nothing to do with whether the evening went well, and it's why an evening alone, doing very little, can leave that same person feeling more like themselves than they have all week. None of this means something is wrong with the people, or the evening, or the person feeling it. It means that energy was flowing in a direction it doesn't naturally replenish from. Jung spent a great deal of his life trying to get people to stop treating this as a flaw to be corrected. This distinction rarely gets explained to people in a way that actually helps. Instead, it gets absorbed as a kind of moral ranking. Extroversion as engaged, sociable, healthy, introversion as withdrawn, something to be gently corrected, a phase to grow out of. Children get told to come out of their shells. Adults get told that networking is simply a skill anyone can learn, as though the issue were competence rather than direction. And so the person whose energy runs inward spends years being measured against a baseline that was never theirs to begin with. Not because anyone is being cruel, but because almost nobody, including the person themselves, has been given the actual vocabulary for what's happening. The tide goes out, and instead of asking where it needs to come back in, everyone, including the person it belongs to, asks why it isn't staying out longer. Number 1, the persona that performs enthusiasm. The persona in Jung's framework is the mask a person wears to meet the expectations of the world around them. And in a culture that treats constant availability and visible enthusiasm as basically mandatory, the persona for someone oriented inward often looks like a permanently switched on version of themselves. It's a convincing performance precisely because it isn't fully fake. There's a real person underneath it who does genuinely enjoy parts of what they're doing. The performance is in the constancy, not the content. Elena worked in marketing for a mid-sized company in Austin, and by every external measure, she was great at her job, warm in meetings, quick with ideas, the person people wanted on a call. What almost no one knew was that Elena spent the last 20 minutes before any video call doing something close to bracing herself, and the first 20 minutes after it recovering. Not because the calls were bad, because performing that version of herself for an hour cost something that didn't show up anywhere on a calendar. For years, Elena assumed this meant she wasn't cut out for the work, or wasn't as naturally good at it as she appeared. What it actually meant was that she was paying a real cost for a persona that worked, and nobody, including her, had ever accounted for the cost. What made it harder for Elena to notice was that the persona worked. People liked her. Her manager once described her in a performance review as a natural, someone who made things look effortless. Elena remembered sitting across from her manager during that review, nodding, accepting the compliment. while privately doing the math on how much of the past year had been spent recovering from exactly the kind of interaction she was being praised for handling so well. There was no way to explain that without it sounding like a complaint about a job she was, by every measure, succeeding at. So she didn't. She filed it, the way most people in her position do, as a private fact about herself that had no place in any conversation about how things were going. If this sounds familiar, start noticing, without judging it, what it costs you to be on, even in situations that go well. Not whether you can do it, whether there's a bill afterward, and what that bill actually looks like. Number 2, the libido that needs somewhere to return to. Jung used the term libido broadly to describe the overall current of psychic energy. Not just sexual energy, but the energy behind attention, motivation, and engagement with life generally. For someone oriented inward, this energy behaves almost like a tide. It goes out into conversations, obligations, other people's needs, and it needs somewhere to come back to. Without that return, the tide doesn't just stay out longer, it starts drawing from reserves that were never meant to be spent that way. And the person starts to feel not tired exactly, but thin, stretched, present in body, mostly absent everywhere else. Marcus grew up in a large, close family that gathered often. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners that ran long. He loved his family, but every gathering, he noticed the same thing happening. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, something in him would quietly check out, even while the rest of him stayed in the room, nodding, smiling, present. For years, he felt guilty about this, like loving his family should mean wanting to be there for 6 hours, not 2. It took him a long time to realize that the guilt was the problem, not the checking out. The checking out was just the tide going as far as it could before it needed to turn around. What eventually shifted things for Marcus wasn't a confrontation or a big conversation. It was a smaller realization that the 2-hour mark wasn't a failure of love, and it wasn't a referendum on how much the gathering mattered to him. It was just where his tide turned. The same way an actual tide turns at a particular point, regardless of how much anyone wants the beach to stay covered a little longer. Once he stopped treating that turning point as evidence of something wrong with him, he noticed something else. He could often stay longer, comfortably, if he knew there was a clear way to step out for 10 minutes. A walk around the block, a few minutes in another room. Not leaving, just a brief return trip so the tide had somewhere to go before it needed to come all the way back in. Nobody else needed to know this was happening. It just made the difference between an evening that drained him for 2 days afterward and one that didn't. Pay attention over the next week to where your own tide tends to turn, not as a rule to enforce, just as information. What does the 2-hour mark feel like for you? Is there one? Number 3, individuation and the tower Jung built for himself. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming a fully integrated person. And unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't treat solitude as incidental to this process. He treated it as necessary. In the early 1920s, Jung began building a stone retreat on the shore of Lake Zurich in a small village called Bollingen, a place with no electricity, no telephone, where he would go, often alone for extended periods. He wasn't hiding from his life. He had a thriving practice, a family, an enormous professional reputation. But he was clear in his own writing that the work of becoming who he actually was, separate from the roles, expectations, and personas that came with all of that, required time and space that simply wasn't available anywhere else. He returned to that tower and added to it for the rest of his life. What's notable about Jung's tower isn't just that he built it, but how he used it. He wasn't escaping a life he disliked. By most accounts, he found his work, his family, and his public role genuinely meaningful. But he seemed to understand something that gets lost in most modern conversations about solitude. That meaningful engagement with the world and meaningful engagement with yourself aren't the same activity, and one can't substitute for the other indefinitely, no matter how good the first one is. He didn't wait until he was unwell, or burned out, or in crisis to retreat to Bollingen. He built it into the rhythm of an otherwise full life. Closer to maintenance than to emergency repair, the difference between changing the oil in a car regularly and waiting for the engine to fail before doing anything about it. This is worth sitting with. One of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, at the height of a demanding public career, concluded that solitude wasn't a reward for finishing the real work. It was the real work, at least some of the time. You don't need a stone tower on a lake, but it might be worth asking, honestly, without the guilt that usually shows up around this question, Whether you've been treating your own need for that kind of space as something to apologize for rather than something to protect. Number 4, hearing the self underneath the noise. Jung used the term the self, capitalized, deliberately to describe something distinct from the ego. Not the part of you that manages your day-to-day life and performs for other people, but a kind of deeper center, the part that has its own sense of what matters, separate from what you've been told should matter. The trouble is that the self tends to be quiet. It doesn't compete well with deadlines, group chats, or other people's opinions about what you should want. It mostly gets heard in the gaps. The quiet hour, the solo walk, the morning before anyone else is awake. Hannah, a nurse in her 30s, told a friend once that she'd spent years assuming she wanted the same things everyone around her seemed to want. A busier social life, more plans, less time alone. It was only during a period of forced solitude after an injury kept her home for several weeks that she noticed something unexpected. She didn't miss the busyness at all. If anything, she felt more like herself than she had in years. It wasn't that she'd become a different person. It was that, for the first time in a long time, there was enough quiet for her to hear what she'd actually wanted all along. What struck Hannah most, looking back, wasn't the specific things she discovered she wanted, though some of them did surprise her. It was how quiet the realizing had felt. No dramatic insight, no single moment of clarity. Just a kind of settling, the way sediment settles in water once nothing's stirring it anymore. She'd spent years assuming that if she ever really listened to herself, she'd hear something urgent, a calling, a big decision waiting to be made. Instead, what she found was much smaller and much steadier, a preference for mornings over evenings, a genuine dislike of group plans she'd been making for years out of habit, a quiet relief at the thought of a weekend with nothing scheduled. None of it was dramatic enough to build a new life around. But all of it had been there the entire time, waiting underneath a schedule that had simply never left room for it to surface. It's a strange thing to grieve, time you didn't get to have with yourself, in a life that, from the outside, looked completely full. Nobody around Hannah had done anything wrong. The years hadn't been wasted, exactly. They'd just been spent facing a direction that was never quite hers. You don't need weeks of forced solitude to test this. Just notice the next time you have an unstructured hour alone, what surfaces, not what you should do with the time, but what you find yourself actually drawn to when no one's watching and nothing's expected. Jung never argued that solitude was better than connection, or that introversion was healthier than extroversion. What he argued was something quieter, that the energy moving through you has a direction, and there's a real cost to spending years pointed the wrong way without ever being allowed to turn around. None of this is an argument for less connection or for treating solitude as some kind of upgrade over relationships. It's closer to a recalibration. Noticing that the tide has a direction, that the direction isn't a flaw, and that the years spent treating it as one were years spent fighting something that was never going to stop being true about you. If solitude has ever felt like something you owed an explanation for, tell us about it. When was the last time you turned down plans to be alone, and how did you feel about it afterward? Not the version you said out loud, the version that was actually true underneath it.